The wind was a cruel thing, a razor's edge honed on the granite peaks of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains. It swept down into the valley, carrying the first bitter promise of winter, and seemed to find every gap in Alara's worn wool shawl. It clawed at her, a personal and malicious assault, just like the eyes of the villagers. Here in the market square of Greycrag, the cold from the people was always worse than the cold from the sky. She stood before the baker's stall, her hands raw and red, clutching the handles of a lopsided wicker basket. Inside, nestled in dry moss, were the last of her potatoes, small, gnarled things that had taken all her strength to dig from the unyielding soil of her parents' forgotten plot, and 2 jars of dark, precious bramble jam, sealed with beeswax she'd scraped from a wild hive. It was all she had. It was meant to be enough for a sack of flour, a brick of salt. It had to be. Mistress Gable, the baker's wife, had a face that looked permanently soured by her own yeast. She peered into the basket, her lips tightening into a thin, dismissive line. Potatoes? We're all drowning in potatoes, girl. And jam? Sugar is a luxury for those who can afford it. Not for well, she let her gaze travel pointedly over Alara's frame, from her broad shoulders to her solid hips, a journey of silent, damning inventory. The shame, a familiar and heavy cloak, settled over Alara. She felt herself shrink, tried to make her body smaller, a feat she had never managed to achieve. She was built like the ancient oaks at the edge of the woods, sturdy, deep-rooted, and wide. In a world of slender birches, she was a constant, glaring anomaly. "They're good potatoes," Alara said, her voice barely a whisper against the wind's howl. "And the jam is made with honey. It will last the winter." A snicker erupted from a group of men loitering near the stall. Jorn, the village elder's son, swaggered forward. He was a man whose cruelty was as predictable as the rising sun, and he shone it on Alara more than anyone. "Last the winter?" he jeered, his voice loud enough for the whole square to hear. "A girl of your size would eat that in a week. Maybe she bartered for it with her shadow. It's certainly large enough to trade." The laughter that followed was sharp and brittle, like ice shattering on stone. Each laugh was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Alara's face burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the cold. She looked down at her own hands, at the dirt permanently ingrained in the creases of her knuckles. These were hands that worked, that hauled water and chopped wood and tilled soil that fought back with every spadeful. Her body was the engine for that work. It was strong, it was resilient. Yet here it was only a punchline. They saw her substance and called it sloth. They saw her strength and called it greed. "Please," she whispered again, directing her plea back to Mistress Gable, her eyes begging. "A little flour. Half a sack." The baker's wife shook her head, emboldened by Jorn's mockery. "We've mouths to feed, real families. We can't afford to subsidize your appetite." The word hung in the air, foul and heavy. She waved a dismissive hand. "Be on your way. You're blocking the paying customers." Alara straightened her back. It was a small, defiant gesture, but it took all the will she possessed. She pulled her basket back, the movement stiff with wounded pride. She would not let them see her cry. She turned, her head held high, and walked away from the stall, the jeers of Jorn and his friends following her like stones thrown at her back. Better check the foundation of her cottage. Might collapse under the strain. She did not run. She walked with a deliberate, measured pace, each step a testament to her refusal to crumble in front of them. But once she was beyond the edge of the market, where the path narrowed and the last of the village's dreary cottages gave way to open, wind-swept heath, the carefully constructed dam of her composure broke. A single, hot tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Then another. Soon, her shoulders were shaking with silent, racking sobs. The potatoes in her basket felt like leaden weights, symbols of her utter failure. Winter was no longer a promise. It was a death sentence. Without flour, without salt to preserve the meager rabbits she might snare, she would starve. Her parents had died in a fever winter 3 years prior, leaving her with the cottage and a legacy of quiet endurance. But endurance required fuel. She had nothing. The village, the only community she had ever known, had cast her out as surely as if they had locked the gates against her. She was alone, adrift in a sea of their contempt. As she sank onto a cold, moss-covered stone, the wind whipped a scrap of conversation past her ears, carried from two old men huddled by the smithy's fire. "The mountain man," one of them rasped, "holed up in his cave. They say he has gold from the old mines. Furs piled to the ceiling. They say he's a giant," the other countered, spitting into the dirt. "A beast that eats men and frightens goats into giving sour milk. No sane person goes up that mountain." Alara's head lifted. The dragon's tooth. She looked up at the jagged peaks that loomed over the valley, their stony spires scraping the bruised gray belly of the sky. It was a place of legends and warnings, a wilderness from which hunters sometimes never returned. But the words echoed in her desolate heart. Riches. Furs. She had nothing to offer a beast, no gold to tempt a man. But she had potatoes. She had jam. And she had a body that, for all the scorn it drew, was strong, could climb, could endure the cold. The path to the village was a dead end. The path up the mountain was a terrifying unknown. But it was not nothing. It was a choice, a desperate, foolish, final choice. She stood up, her tears drying in the frigid air. The shame was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but something else was hardening around it. A sliver of resolve, sharp as flint. She would not die here, at the feet of their mockery. If she was to die, it would be on her own terms, reaching for a chance no matter how slim. She adjusted the basket on her hip, turned her back on Greycrag, and began to walk toward the mountain. The ascent was a brutal pilgrimage. The path that snaked up the dragon's tooth was less a trail and more a suggestion, a faint memory of deer tracks and forgotten hunters' routes. It fought her with every step. Thorny brambles tore at her skirts and shawl, leaving angry red scratches on her skin. Loose scree shifted under her boots, threatening to send her tumbling back down into the valley of her despair. The wind, which had been a torment in the village, became a physical enemy here, a relentless bully that shoved and screamed, trying to pry her from the mountainside. Yet, with every agonizing step, a strange transformation began to take place within Alara. Down in Greycrag, her body had been a cage of shame, a source of constant humiliation. Here, on the unforgiving slope, it became her greatest asset. The solid weight of her legs provided a stable anchor against the gale. The layers of her own flesh, so often derided, became a welcome insulation against the biting cold that grew more severe with every foot she climbed. The strength in her back and shoulders, honed by years of labor, allowed her to haul herself over rockfalls and push through dense, snow-dusted thickets. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of gratitude for the form she inhabited. It was not failing her. It was keeping her alive. Her internal monologue, usually a chorus of remembered insults, began to quiet, replaced by the simple, rhythmic commands of survival. Breathe. Step. Hold. Breathe. Step. Hold. She walked until the sun, a pale, watery disk, began to bleed its weak light into the western peaks. The valley below was a quilt of darkening gray and brown, the lights of Greycrag flickering like hostile, distant stars. She was truly alone now. Fear, cold and sharp, tried to find purchase in her heart, but it was crowded out by sheer, bone-deep exhaustion. She found a small overhang, a shallow scoop in the rock that offered meager shelter from the wind, and huddled within it. She ate one of the gnarled potatoes raw, the earthy, starchy taste a bland comfort in her mouth. Sleep was not a peaceful respite but a series of shivering, fitful dozes, her dreams haunted by the jeering face of Jorn and the vast, indifferent emptiness of the mountain. When dawn broke, it was to a world painted in shades of gray. A low-hanging mist clung to the mountainside, muffling sound and reducing visibility to a few dozen feet. It was a disorienting, ghostly world, and for a moment, despair washed over her again. How could she find a mythical cave in this suffocating fog? But then, she smelled it, faint but undeniable, the scent of wood smoke. It was a thread of hope in the damp, cold air. With renewed purpose, she pushed herself to her feet, her muscles screaming in protest, and followed the scent. Her nose lifted to the air like a hound's. The trail became steeper, the rocks slick with moisture. The smell grew stronger, a rich, resinous promise of warmth and life. It led her to a sheer cliff face, a wall of granite that seemed to block all progress. She was about to turn back, her heart sinking, when she saw it. Set so cunningly into the rock that it was almost invisible was a door. It was not a crude slab of wood but a masterfully crafted entrance of dark, heavy timber, bound with black iron hinges. A thin curl of smoke escaped from a cleverly hidden flue carved into the rock above it. This was no hermit's hovel. This was a fortress. Her courage faltered. This was the home of the man they called a giant, a beast. What was she doing here? The memory of Mistress Gable's sneer and Jorn's laughter provided the answer. She had come too far to turn back. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she raised a trembling hand and knocked. The sound was swallowed by the stone and the mist. She knocked again, louder this time, the rap of her knuckles sharp and desperate. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, with a low groan of protesting hinges, the heavy door swung inward. The man who filled the doorway blotted out the light from within. Giant was not an exaggeration. He was immense, a head and a half taller than any man in the village, with shoulders as broad as the doorframe he occupied. A wild, dark beard descended down his chest, and his hair was a tangled mane. He wore simple clothes of leather and wool, but they were well tended. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a mountain given human form. His eyes, a startlingly clear shade of gray like a winter sky, fixed on her. They held no malice, no immediate threat, but a deep, unnerving stillness, an assessing quality that seemed to look right through her skin and weigh the substance of her soul. Alara's throat went dry. All the words she had rehearsed vanished. She simply stood there, clutching her basket, the wind whipping her hair around her face. She was a supplicant, a refugee, a fool. She felt his gaze travel over her, the same path Mistress Gables had taken, but the feeling was entirely different. There was no scorn, no judgment. It was a practical, thoughtful observation. He looked at her sturdy boots, caked with mud. He looked at the solid column of her neck and the breadth of her shoulders under the worn shawl. He looked at her hands, red and chapped but strong, gripping the wicker handle. He seemed to see the journey she had taken, the strength it required. Finally, she found her voice, a strained whisper. I have come to trade." She thrust the basket forward, a pathetic offering against the backdrop of his imposing presence. He did not look at the basket. His gaze remained on her. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the mournful cry of the wind. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. He would turn her away. He would laugh. He spoke. His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting deep within the earth. It was not a roar, not a growl, but a quiet, resonant sound that vibrated in her bones. And what he said stunned her into absolute stillness. "My cave needs a woman like you." It was not a compliment. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same gravity as one might state that a roof needs shingles or a fire needs wood. For the first time in her life, her size, her very being, was not described as being too much, too fat, too large, too hungry. It was described as being needed. The simple, profound declaration cleaved through years of accumulated shame. He stepped back, holding the door open. It was an invitation into the mountain itself, into a world she could not possibly imagine. Numb with shock and a dawning, fragile flicker of hope, Alara stepped across the threshold, out of the wind and into the warmth. The air inside was warm and dry, thick with the scent of wood smoke, curing herbs, and tanned leather. The term cave was a profound injustice to the space he had created. The entrance tunnel, smoothly carved from the living rock, opened into a vast central chamber. The ceiling soared high overhead, lost in shadow, but the living area was illuminated by the steady, hypnotic glow of a massive fire pit in the center of the room. The firelight danced across walls that were not damp and rough, but smoothed and lined with expertly fitted wooden shelves. And the shelves were laden with riches, though not the gold and jewels the villagers whispered of. These were the riches of survival, of true wealth in a harsh land. There were stacks of neatly folded furs, wolf, bear, and deer piled high. Braids of dried onions and garlic hung from wooden pegs. Slabs of cured bacon and smoked fish were suspended from the ceiling beams. There were clay pots filled with grain, sacks of dried beans, and countless glass jars containing preserved fruits and vegetables, their colors like jewels in the firelight. In one corner stood a forge, complete with a bellows and an anvil, tools of iron and steel hanging in perfect order. In another, a workbench was covered in half-finished wood carvings, intricate knots and animal figures emerging from blocks of pine and oak. This was not the den of a mindless beast. It was the workshop of a master craftsman, a sanctuary of order and profound self-sufficiency. Kalen, the mountain man, closed the heavy door, the sound a solid thud that shut out the whining wind and the world that had rejected her. The sudden silence was immense. He gestured toward the fire. "Sit. Warm yourself." Alara moved as if in a dream, her eyes wide as she took in every detail. She settled on a low wooden stool near the hearth, the heat from the flames seeping into her chilled bones, a comfort so deep it was almost painful. She placed her basket on the floor beside her, its contents seeming even more pitiful in this place of abundance. Kalen moved to the far side of the chamber, his footsteps silent for such a large man. He returned with a wooden bowl of steaming stew and a thick slice of dark, heavy bread. He handed it to her without a word. She took it, her hands trembling slightly. The stew was thick with meat and root vegetables, savory and nourishing. The bread was dense and nutty. It was the most satisfying meal she had eaten in years. She ate slowly, deliberately, acutely aware of his presence. He did not watch her with impatience or condescension. He sat on a larger stool across the fire, sharpening a long hunting knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic shhhhh of stone on steel a strangely calming sound. He was giving her space, allowing her to recover from her ordeal. When she had finished, scraping the last of the stew from the bowl with the bread, she felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the warmth of a full belly, the simple, profound comfort of being fed and safe. She looked up at him, meeting his steady gray eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and stronger than it had been at his door. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and took the empty bowl from her. He then picked up her basket, finally examining its contents. He lifted one of the gnarled potatoes, turning it over in his huge hand. He uncorked one of the jam jars and sniffed it, his expression unreadable. For a terrible moment, she thought he would find her offering wanting, that he would deem it worthless just as Mistress Gable had. Instead, he looked at her. "You dug these from the high-field soil," he stated. "It wasn't a question. It's all rock and clay there. Hard work for a small yield." He looked at the jam again. "And wild brambles. The thorns are wicked. You have skilled hands." Tears pricked her eyes. He saw the labor, the struggle, the value in what she had brought. He did not see a meager offering. He saw the effort it represented. He placed her basket on a shelf, alongside his own far grander stores, giving it a place of honor. In that single, simple gesture he gave her a place, too. Her life in the mountain began not with a formal agreement, but with a quiet, unspoken understanding. The next morning, she awoke from the deepest sleep of her life, cocooned in a thick pile of furs on a raised wooden pallet. Kalen was already awake, stoking the fire. He did not give her orders. He simply went about his work, and she, guided by a lifetime of habit and a deep-seated need to be useful, found her own rhythm alongside him. She took his worn leather tunic, it seems frayed, and using a needle and sinew she found in a sewing kit, mended it with small, neat stitches. He observed her work with a silent nod of approval. She learned to grind dried herbs with a stone pestle and mortar, the fragrant dust filling the air. She learned to bank the fire at night so that a bed of hot coals remained in the morning. She took the tough winter vegetables from his stores, turnips, carrots, parsnips, and made stews and soups that filled the cave with savory warmth. He, in turn, taught her things she had never known. He showed her how to properly skin a rabbit with a few deft movements, wasting nothing. He demonstrated how to identify the best wood for carving, how to feel the grain beneath her fingertips. Their days fell into a pattern, a quiet domesticity forged in the heart of the stone. Communication was sparse, but it was potent. A shared glance across the fire could convey more than a half-hour of chatter in the village. A simple gesture, him placing a log on the fire for her leaving a hot mug of steeped herbs by his workbench, was a conversation in itself. She began to understand that his silence was not a sign of brutishness, but of a profound peace with himself and his surroundings. He did not need to fill the air with noise. She discovered his gentleness in small, unexpected ways. He kept a handful of hardy mountain goats in a penned-off section of a neighboring cavern. She watched him one morning, his huge, calloused hands surprisingly tender as he checked a kid's leg for injury. She saw the way he would leave offerings of seeds and nuts on a flat stone outside for the winter birds. This was not the monster of the villagers' tales. This was a man who had chosen solitude over a world that had likely judged him as harshly as it had judged her. One evening, a blizzard descended upon the mountain, a howling vortex of wind and snow that raged for 3 days. The world outside their door vanished into a churning wall of white. They were sealed inside, prisoners of the storm. The forced proximity should have been tense, but it wasn't. The cave became a haven, a bubble of warmth and security against the elemental fury outside. On the second night of the storm, as they sat by the fire, the wind shrieking like a banshee through the rocks, she found the courage to ask, "Why did you come here?" He was carving a piece of wood, the knife moving with hypnotic precision. He didn't stop, but his hands slowed. "The lowlands are full of people," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And people are full of rules. Rules about who you are, what you should be, how much space you are allowed to take up." He looked at her then, a direct and meaningful gaze. "My size was always a problem, a threat. They looked at me and saw a weapon. Or a fool. Never a man." Alara's breath caught in her throat. In his story, she heard the echo of her own. The shame of taking up too much space. The pain of being defined by her body. "I understand," she whispered. He set down his carving, a half-finished bird with delicate wings. "I know you do," he said. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not just acceptance in his eyes, but a deep, resonant empathy. He saw her, the real her, beneath the flesh and bone that the world had taught her to hate. In the heart of the blizzard, surrounded by stone and silence, Alara felt the last of her old shame begin to melt away, warmed by the steady flame of his understanding. She was not a cast-off. She was not a punchline. She was home. The blizzard eventually broke, leaving the world outside scoured clean and buried in a profound, glittering silence. Spring arrived late on the mountain, a slow, grudging thaw that crept up the slopes. Patches of stubborn snow gave way to damp earth and the first bright green shoots of mountain sorrel. With the changing season came a shift in Alara. The quiet competence she had always possessed was now imbued with a confidence she had never known. Her movements were sure, her spirit settled. The mountain had stripped away her shame and replaced it with a sense of belonging carved from the rock itself. She no longer thought of herself as fat. She thought of herself as strong. She no longer felt large. She felt present. One clear, bright morning, as she was outside gathering the first edible herbs near the entrance to the cave, she heard it. Voices. The sound was alien in the vast silence of the peaks. A harsh, grating intrusion. Her blood ran cold. She recognized the coarse laughter, the arrogant tone. "Jorn." She scrambled back to the cave entrance just as he and 2 other men from Greycrag appeared over the ridge. They were armed with crude axes and hunting spears, their faces a mixture of greed, fear, and belligerence. They had clearly suffered through the winter. Their clothes were more ragged, their faces gaunt and wolfish. They stopped short when they saw her, their eyes widening in surprise. Well, well, Bjorn sneered, recovering quickly. Look what the beast didn't eat. Grown even fatter on his hoard. Have you? The other men laughed, a nervous, ugly sound. The old Alara would have flinched. She would have wrapped her arms around herself, trying to disappear. But that Alara was buried under the winter's snow. This Alara stood her ground. She planted her feet, her body a solid, immovable barrier before the home she had helped to build. What do you want, Bjorn? She asked, her voice low and steady. It did not tremble. It did not plead. It was the voice of the mountain, calm and unyielding. Bjorn's smirk faltered for a second, surprised by her defiance. We've come for what's ours. The village is starving. The beast in that cave has been hoarding supplies, maybe gold. We heard you came up here. Figured he killed you and took your things. Now we see he just kept you as a pet. Step aside, fat one. We have business with your master. He is not my master, Alara said, the words clear and sharp as splintered ice. And this is my home. There is nothing for you here. Your home. Bjorn took a step forward, brandishing his axe. A pigsty for a pig. We're not leaving empty-handed. Either you move, or we move you. He lunged. But before he could reach her, a great shadow fell over them all. Kalen emerged from the mouth of the cave, silent as the mist. He did not rush. He did not roar. He simply filled the space behind Alara, a towering figure of quiet, absolute power. His presence was more terrifying than any overt threat. He placed a hand on Alara's shoulder, a gesture that was both protective and affirming. He was not shielding her. He was standing with her. Bjorn and his men froze, their bravado evaporating in the face of the reality of the giant. They had come expecting a mindless brute they could trick or overwhelm. They found instead an intelligent, formidable man standing beside a woman who radiated a strength they could not comprehend. Kalen's gray eyes, cold as the highest peaks, settled on Bjorn. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried the weight of an avalanche. She told you to leave. It was not a request. It was the closing of a door, the final word. The two men behind Bjorn began to back away, their eyes wide with terror, their weapons suddenly feeling like children's toys. Bjorn hesitated, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. He looked from Kalen's immense form to Alara's resolute face. He saw no fear in her. He saw no victim. He saw a woman who had found her power, and he saw the man who stood beside her, not as a keeper, but as a partner. With a final, choked curse, Bjorn turned and scrambled away. His men close on his heels, their retreat clumsy and panicked. They stumbled down the mountain path, fleeing the quiet strength they could never hope to conquer. The silence they left behind was vast and peaceful. Alara stood for a long moment, the adrenaline slowly receding, leaving in its place a profound sense of victory. She had not hidden. She had not cowered. She had defended her home, her life. Kalen's hand was still on her shoulder, a warm, heavy weight of reassurance and respect. She turned to look up at him, her heart full. In his eyes, she saw none of the pity or condescension the world had always shown her. She saw pride. She saw affection. She saw an equal. He slowly lowered his hand from her shoulder, his callous thumb brushing against her cheek in a gesture of startling tenderness. His touch did not ask for anything, simply gave. It was an acknowledgement of everything they had built together in the heart of the stone, a silent promise of everything yet to come. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the valley, Alara stood at the cave's entrance, looking down. The distant lights of Greycrag began to flicker on, tiny and insignificant. She felt no anger toward the village, no lingering bitterness. She felt only a strange, quiet pity for their smallness, for their inability to see value where it truly lay. They had looked at her and seen a flaw, a burden to be mocked. They had looked at this mountain and seen only a place of fear. They were blind. Her body, the vessel they had scorned, had carried her up to this sanctuary. Her spirit, which they had tried to crush, had found a place to thrive. What the world called too much was, here, exactly enough. She was not a mistake. She was a necessity. Kalen came to stand beside her, his presence a warm and solid comfort against the cooling air. He handed her a steaming mug, his fingers brushing hers. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They watched the stars begin to prick the darkening sky, two solitary souls who had found in each other. And in the heart of the mountain, the one thing neither had ever had, a place to truly belong.